Hello, Dr. Vicki Peterson here. I wanted to share with you today kind of a continuation. We've been talking a little bit about the Gluten E-Summit that occurred a couple of weeks ago now. And the interview I wanted to discuss today was when Dr. Tom O'Brien interviewed Dr. Michael Marsh. Those of you who have celiac disease have heard that last name Marsh before. You might just not have known it was an individual. So Michael Marsh is the man who developed the classification system for villous atrophy. So if you've been diagnosed with a celiac disease formerly from an intestinal biopsy, you were told you had Marsh 3. And that meant complete villous atrophy. So the little finger-like projections or the carpeting of your small intestine that's supposed to be like a shag carpeting, like my fingers, was pretty mowed down, more like Berber, as Dr. Tom O'Brien likes to call it. And that complete annihilation of those villi is deemed a Marsh 3. So that classification system is what gastroenterologists use to diagnose celiac disease, and it's been around since the 80s. Imagine, if you will, being the person that created that classification system and being in complete disagreement with how it's being used. So that was what we found out, and certainly Dr. Marsh has not been silent for, 35 years or so. He created the system in '82. In '92, he spoke out at a conference where doctors were sort of arguing about the fact that if someone had positive blood tests for celiac disease, yet their intestinal biopsy, so what the lining of their intestines looked like, if it looked normal and looked okay and it wasn't completely eradicated, that there was no point in recommending a gluten-free diet for them. And Dr. Marsh told in the interview that he stood up at this conference, and so that's in 1992, and said, no, that's not the case in his opinion. And he stated that as soon as blood tests were positive, regardless of the state of what the intestinal lining looked like, so whether it was a Marsh 0, which meant quote-unquote normal, or Marsh 1 or 2 or 3, that you didn't have to wait for that complete eradication of a Marsh 3 in order to be told, in his opinion, that you should stop eating gluten. And he went on to say that medically and legally, he felt that it was kind of a disaster for doctors to do this, because he felt that nutritional deficiencies and osteoporosis, not to mention cancer, could occur in these individuals who had positive blood tests yet negative biopsies. So this is the father of this classification system, completely disagreeing with what medicine has been doing these 30 years since. So it's a fascinating interview, and some of the other gems that came out of it. Dr. O'Brien asked Dr. Marsh what percentage of the population he felt came within the Marsh 1 and 2 area, so of the population at large. And so we know that those who have Marsh 3, or that complete villous atrophy, that's 1% of the population, because those are the ones that are given the diagnosis of celiac disease. But he felt that 29% fell into that Marsh 1 or 2. So now you're looking at a total of 30% of the population he feels should be on a gluten-free diet, which goes along with what we've been saying for so long. Another really interesting point I thought was he made a very big deal about discussing the fact that he's also in disagreement when celiac disease is talked about as a small intestine problem. And he uses the word gluten sensitivity quite a bit in this interview as well. But for a long time, when I talk about working with patients with Crohn's disease and working with patients with colitis, and doing well with these patients, doing very well with these patients, and getting them off gluten, I'm often chastised, saying that well, gluten is affecting the small intestine, it doesn't affect the large intestine, so it doesn't make sense that someone with a large intestine disease, quote unquote, would benefit from a gluten-free diet. And Dr. Marsh completely annihilates that misnomer, because he states that the mesenteric immune system, which is the mesentery is of the intestines, is throughout the small intestine and the large intestine, and that absolutely a gluten sensitivity, celiac disease, is a disease of the intestine complete, so small intestine and large intestine. So that was really fascinating and a nice validation for what we see, because as I said, it's been something that all I could do is explain clinically, that we see it with our patients, but not so much as far as the research is concerned. So that was his explanation of that. He also made a very interesting statement, which is that he allows his patients, now he's in England, he's over at Oxford, but that he allows his celiac patients to drink beer. And then he quickly said English beer. Now I doubt the temperature of the beer, because if you've been to England, English beer is served warm. I'm not a beer drinker, so I could really care less. But for those who are very excited about beer, he allows his patients to drink beer, and he says that he's never seen any adverse effect. So if there's something different about English beer versus American beer, other than the temperature, as I stated, I have absolutely no idea. But Dr. O'Brien was kind of flabbergasted to hear him say that, as was I, but there you go. So I think we need some beer studies, but he was pretty adamant about the fact that he hadn't seen any negative results in his celiac patients who drank English beer. So there you go. I had a couple of other things I wanted to discuss. Let me just glance at my notes for a second. Yeah, well, he mentioned a few other researchers, so he wasn't just talking about himself, of course, but there's a Dr. Kaukkinen from Finland who showed that the antibodies or the immune system reacting to gluten can occur for a full 7 years prior to any damage occurring to the mucosa or to the lining of the small intestine, which was basically corroborating his feeling that you shouldn't wait until such complete damage had occurred. He also mentioned a Dr. Knott who showed an increased fatty acid binding protein. So this was a protein that showed cell death actually, and this increase in it in the intestine occurred while the mucosa still looked normal. So he was giving a number of studies. Dr. Ludvigsen was another researcher that he cited that also showed increased mortality in people who showed inflammation of the intestine, but still had that normal structure of the lining of the intestine. So he gave a number of examples of corroboration for the fact that you really don't want to wait too long, because you're kind of relegating people to serious disease that, if you had caught them sooner, would have protected them against cancer and osteoporosis and deficiencies, et cetera, et cetera. And last but not least, he brought up the fact that the major blood tests we use for celiac disease, the transglutaminase, the tissue transglutaminase, or TTG test, and we've talked about this for a long time, so there is a lot of validation, but what he mentioned was that that test is 97 to 99% sensitive and accurate only when you have the Marsh 3, meaning that total villous atrophy again, and that when you just have partial atrophy, so earlier on, which is when we want to diagnose people, right, is early on, that test is only 27 to 33% accurate. Not very impressive, right? So we've talked about this before, but I'm not the father of the celiac disease classification system, nor am I a researcher. I'm a clinician, and to hear this corroboration from this gentleman, and by the way, he, I don't know if he's gluten sensitive himself, but sharp as a tack, well into his 80s, sharp, sharp man, so we should all be so fortunate as to have brains that work so eloquently and so precisely when we're that age. But I did want to, the interview was fascinating. It was an hour long, and I'm just kind of giving you a synopsis of some of this. But the real take home, and we've said this for a while, is that biopsy, oh, and by the way, one last thing, a biopsy is a very invasive procedure if you've ever had one. he prefers what's called a rectal biopsy. So you know that part of the anatomy, but this is something that they actually put a slurry, he said, of wheat flour and water in the rectum. Sorry, but there you go. But this is not very invasive. And then they do a biopsy of that area. And he said the beauty of that test is he feels it's very accurate, and someone can just go right to work, right back home. They don't have any downtime. And he said it's a test that in England that they do, and in the Anglo-Saxon nations that are tougher. And he kind of made some cute little remark that we Americans are kind of wussy and wouldn't want to do that. But I think a test that's less invasive would be excellent. So something else to learn. But if you're being told by your doctor that, oh, you have a Marsh 1 or a Marsh 2 or even a Marsh 0 on your intestinal biopsy, so you're fine to eat gluten. No, not according to the father of the classification. So you now know that data, and you can certainly get the transcript through the Gluten e-Summit. So I hope you found that interesting. I certainly did, and it's really, really fascinating information and very much aligns with what we say and what we do, and it's just certainly wonderful to hear it from the master himself. So if you have any questions, if you're having any health issues, always feel free to contact me. That's why I'm here. And until next time, I wish you very good health.